Welcome back to Getting to the Top, where we interview transformational leaders about their leadership journey in hopes that we can inspire you on your own journey. So today I have the absolute delight of interviewing Rueanna Haynes, she's an international climate law and governance specialist. She's a TEDx 2020 speaker with over a decade of experience in the UN climate process. She's a former Trinidad and Tobago diplomat. She's negotiated for the Caribbean community as well as the Alliance of Small Island States, including in the development of the Sustainable Development Goals. At present, she is the Senior Legal Advisor at Climate Analytics and Director of Climate Analytics Caribbean Office in Trinidad and Tobago. She provides strategic, technical, and diplomatic advice to island states in climate change negotiations, as well as training for officials who are new to the UN climate process. And honestly, I must tell you, we could not be in better hands. She's dynamic, she is flawless, she is wonderful, she's hilarious, super smart, and she's just an absolute delight. I am so glad that we've finally been able to get her to have this conversation. Welcome, Rueanna.
Thank you, Racquel, and thank you for the very, very kind words. It's a real pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you and to be a part of this really amazing program.
Wonderful. So Rueanna is, and with all of those things, she looks like she's just stepped out of high school, which is great. She's not quite that young, but she looks like it, which is phenomenal. And she has the energy for it, I'll tell you that. So Rueanna, how did you get started? And it's so interesting because a lot of people study law, but you have studied law and managed to turn it into studying law to serve on behalf of the climate. So tell us, what did you do? Were you always going to pursue law?
Yes and no. When I was 7 years old, I announced to my parents that I was going to be a lawyer. I don't remember what informed that announcement at the time, but I was certain that that is what I was going to be. Throughout my studies, various things interested me. I was a student of languages in high school, and history as well. I went on, when I started university, I actually started doing a history degree with a minor in French. And then towards the end of my first year, I thought to myself, but why am I doing history if I wanted to do law? And I thought to myself, well, maybe I'll just apply for a transfer because this really isn't what I wanted to do, even though I'm enjoying it. And so I did apply. I did apply for the transfer. And I think in that year, out of the hundreds of people who would have applied on the St. Augustine campus for that transfer, I was the only one to get it. So I decided, well, this probably was meant to be at that point in time. So yes, I always did think I would study the law, but I did get waylaid along the way and eventually found my way back.
But it's funny, I think history actually makes a really great foundation for law, right? Because when your laws are typically very historical things, and understanding how nations develop, it informs the laws that they have in place. So I mean, I can see, for me, at least from this vantage point, how those two interests would have been closely aligned.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's it's a lot of reading, it's a lot of textual analysis involved, I think, in both disciplines. And you really have to, have kind of a keen interest to understand the development of the law and the theory of the law as well. A keen interest in also the way civilizations have developed and the history of the development of the law in the context of, particular societies, especially for ours with our post-colonial heritage. It's quite important.
Yeah, no, I think that would have been really important. So when you announced to your parents that you were going to become an attorney, what did they say? Were they like, oh, that's adorable? And then the year later, when it was still the thing you were saying, they were like, that's interesting.
Yeah, I don't think anybody was particularly surprised.
Really?
Yeah, even as a 7-year-old, I was quite opinionated at the time and not bashful.
Well, thank God.
So I don't think anybody was remotely surprised actually.
Excellent. And so, then you're studying. So how did you then make the leap to study history instead of immediately pursuing law out of high school?
I think well, high school was not my favorite time of life, I would say. And at the time, I was convinced I wanted to be a languages a student. At the time, I couldn't pursue both Spanish and French at A levels in my school. They didn't offer them both together. You had to choose.
Mm.
Um, so I chose French and history. And because at the time, history was really my top love. I studied, I was able to, study quite quite a broad spectrum of not just the history of Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, but the history of the world. We also did, U.S. history as well. And I just found it was such an interesting area and even multidisciplinary a bit in and of itself. So I went into university taking up courses like the history of South Asian civilizations, African history, more Caribbean history. I really was really just very into everything historical. At one point, I even wanted to be an architect. I think that was Indiana Jones, though. I think that was that. I think that was the the Indiana Jones influence. But well, not an archaeologist, sorry. Um, so yeah, I was just really focused on that at the time, and I think it was simply that I had just forgotten. I had just forgotten that prior to my love of history, there had been a real focus on wanting to study the law itself and to be a lawyer. And when it occurred to me that this is something I could still do, I just did what I needed to do it. I had a conversation with my family because at the time you had to leave the St. Augustine campus and do 2 years in Barbados, and
Mm.
that was a different level of financial commitment. So I had a conversation with them, if I apply, if I am successful, will you be able to support me? Is this something I can do? And they said, we will figure it out. So I did it.
Oh, that's so brilliant. It's funny. I spoke to Stacy Kennedy, who's head of CAF, and she was saying just the same thing that, her family supported her when she was making really bold decisions about her study for her career. Her parents were like, listen, we'll figure it out. We'll just, if you get through, we'll figure it out. I think that's such a beautiful sentiment.
Yeah, definitely. I could not have done it otherwise. I mean, it was, yeah, like the scale in terms of the level of financial commitment was completely different.
Yeah. Well, that's lovely. So then you graduate from with this degree in law. So what's the first thing that you do?
Um, Law school.
Okay.
So yeah, so in our system, we move from the undergraduate to law school, which is to focus on practicing the law and either becoming, an instructing attorney or an actual advocate. Um, and that was interesting. Uh, but even in the course of that, I started to realize, I love the law and I love the study of the law. I love the theory of the law. My favorite course was evidence, because it was theory based. We all had to do the same courses. There were no electives. So it included all the trial advocacy and all of the practical courses as well. And I realized I wasn't so interested in the practice of the actual law. There was some of it that was interesting to me in terms of understanding the application of the civil proceedings rules, but more from and of course the way criminal law works, but more from a theoretical. It was always more theoretical for me in terms of where my interest lay. So that's why I was drawn more to evidence, because evidence was really, really rooted in the theory of law. So coming out of law school, I didn't have any interest whatsoever in stepping foot in a courtroom.
Mhm.
or I practice in law. I thought to myself, there has to be something more.
Mhm.
There has to be something more because it's not that I didn't love the law. I continued to love the law, but I needed for there to be something more. And that's why I found myself at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Oh, nice. Okay. So Ministry of Foreign Affairs straight out the gate. That must have been
Straight out the gate, yes.
daunting. Huh?
It was. Um, it was. When I started at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I didn't start on a legal track. I started on an international relations track, and I hadn't had international relations training. I'd studied international law, but international law and international relations are very close cousins, but they are not the same. And even, to write for diplomacy as opposed to writing for the law, it's a completely different discipline.
Mhm.
So I almost felt as if I had to be retrained. I remember the first memorandum I wrote when I arrived in the ministry. I remember my director looking at me with absolute horror. We cannot write like this. We do not write like this in English because legal writing is, very directive,
Yeah. Yeah, this is
but
like I'm issuing you a summons.
right. So I remember her look. I will never forget her look of absolute horror. Like, what is this? So yes, it was a really, really fun challenge for me because I felt as if I was acquiring a new skill.
Mhm.
Um, and but it also allowed me to, it was international relations. Yes, it was more into diplomacy, but it allowed me to get into those areas of the law that I was also still interested in the context of international law. I was really focused at the time on regional law as well, the development of the CARICOM single market and economy and competition law, looking at the EU model and all of these things, really, really, really worthy things that captured my imagination when I was in undergrad. Um, so having the opportunity to work at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs allowed me to explore those things in new ways.
Excellent, excellent. So, once you learned to write like a diplomat and not like a lawyer, which are could not be further night from day. Then you would have progressed through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to do incredibly amazing things. So what would you attribute your success to? And I love that you described the learning of something new as a fun challenge. So you have been trained to do one thing. You're now thrust into doing something that's related. So you have context, but there's so much more information that you need to be able to execute on this new mandate now. And
Mhm.
rather than being absolutely overwhelmed and hiding under a table, you're like, well, this is a fun challenge. Let's figure out how to speak and be a diplomat and
Mhm.
operate in a diplomatic sphere. So tell us
Mhm.
about what that was like.
It was so exciting. My brain, honestly, from what I can remember, it felt like I went into deep, deep sponge mode. I was just absorbing everything that I could have, and really, I was actually quite hyper focused on the entire experience. Um, so my first few months in the ministry, there were various trainings that we had to be a part of. And we were also there was just like mountains of documentation thrown at us. Read this, read that, understand this, understand that. And I remember I was given because I was in the multilateral relations division, I was given a brief that had been prepared the year before for the 64th session of the United Nations General Assembly, which would have been in 2009. And it was a bound document of about 300 pages, it was this thick. And I was just told to read it so that I can understand what they do in multilateral relations and how it works. So I sat and I read it for the first couple of months that I was in the ministry. I sat and I read the document, the whole thing. And that really gave me the foundation to understand the context and to basically reskill to see where, what I knew intersected with what I was learning.
Yeah.
And so by the time I started being given tasks and assignments, prepare this brief for this upcoming meeting, I had a really, really good foundation and understood where I was, what the starting point was. And that was great for me because these were things that I had always wanted to learn about and to understand more of.
Spectacular. So then what happens next? You move from this first position. What's the next thing you're doing, or what's the next job?
Well, so it really is one job, but just with several different aspects. So
Okay.
I would say most of my career really has been propelled by me being kind of in the right place at the right time, but also ready to
Mm,
embrace change and ready to embrace the new challenge. So it was, a matter of, a matter of circumstance meeting preparedness.
mm,
Um, so the year I joined the ministry was 2009. And in that year, Trinidad and Tobago hosted the fifth Summit of the Americas in April 2009, and it was the first international meeting attended by Barack Obama when he was elected president the year before. And Trinidad and Tobago also hosted the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in November of that year. In addition to the fact that we were hosting these two extremely high-profile multilateral meetings, the international community was in the process of trying to agree what should have been the Paris Agreement in 2009. So the Copenhagen Accord, which everybody knows was a failure at the time, but we were in the process of getting ready for that Copenhagen conference, COP15. And so it was a really, 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 really seminal time for multilateralism, and a really important time for Trinidad and Tobago as a very small country that, you know, had the opportunity to exert so much influence over these processes as a host.
yeah.
Um, so I arrived in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at this time. So what that meant was that, you know, immediately I was assigned to, I think the officer who had been following environmental issues, climate change related issues had been posted out. So immediately I was assigned to their desk,
Wow.
all environmental issues. And I think I was doing environment and intellectual property or something like that. And so I was charged with, preparing briefs, and eventually when we got to the CHOGM conference in November 2009, I would have been a part of the Trinidad and Tobago delegation at the time, probably the most junior officer on the Trinidad and Tobago delegation at the time. And um, my assignment was the climate change discussion. And for that conference, because it was actually the last opportunity at the global level, the last multilateral meeting happening before Copenhagen, you had a Commonwealth Plus meeting. So
Mm,
it wasn't just the regular heads of state of government from the Commonwealth countries. You also had the President of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, coming in. You also had the then Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, Yves Debord, coming in, and you had all of these climate officials coming in to try to fashion a pre-agreement heading into Copenhagen, which eventually became the Port of Spain Consensus,
mm,
which is actually where we have some of the first mentions of fast start financing that eventually rolled into what we know now as the Green Climate Fund.
mm.
So all of these things had seeds in that meeting, and I was really privileged at the time to be some small part of the discussion as the one officer in the ministry with that particular portfolio. So by the time we got to the Copenhagen conference, my job was really to keep my minister apprised of what was going on, even though I wasn't actually there in
Yeah.
person. I was sleeping on European time and following the conference every day, and I had to provide a report to the minister first thing every morning, and all of these things. It was a big deal. So yeah, so that was my first assignment, which somehow remains my assignment several
Baptism by
years
fire. But
several
so
years later. Yeah.
were you interested in climate at the time? Like when you were assigned to this climate change desk, what did you think? You're like, well, this is interesting, or
Yeah, well, I thought it was absolutely fascinating. Now, I had at the time my focus more was on trade,
Mhm.
and on international trade and regional trade, as I said. But what attracted me to the climate change discourse? So I've always been interested in environmental related issues. I'm one of those, Captain Planet children of the 90s who was raised on we do not litter and all of these things, the campaigns
Yes.
that were happening around the Rio conference in 92 and everything that happened in the lead up to and after that. Um, so I'd always had an interest in environmental issues. But in the climate change discourse, I think what attracted me the most was the way the discussion was conducted. So the fact that as a small island developing state, Trinidad and Tobago would participate in those negotiations, not only in its national capacity, but also as a member of the Alliance of Small Island States.
Mm.
And, the idea that there was an alliance of small island developing states from all over the world that found common cause and were negotiating on this particular issue was one that was just really really, really fascinating for me. And I really wanted to understand more about how the uses functioned and I got all the stories of how the alliance came into being. And yeah, all of those things were interesting to me.
Excellent. And who were or what was some of the support and help that you got along the way? Because, you know, you come into this ministry, you're having to prepare briefings for ministers on really high stakes global negotiations. Um, how did you who did you lean on for support, and what kind of support did you get?
Primarily, I mean, coming from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the way our system is set up, the ministry is not necessarily providing the technical specialized advice because
Mm,
it's, you know, diplomacy writ large. By and large, foreign service officers see themselves as the ultimate generalists, right? You have to be able to do everything, a
mm,
little bit of everything. And so, in that context, at the time, the technical support would have come from, I think at the time it was the Ministry of the Environment or Ministry of Water and the Environment or Ministry of Public Utilities and the Environment. It's always changing. So I don't remember what was the particular, what it was called at that time. But yeah, it was still um, Kishan Kumar Singh was, still in that role as the director of the Multilateral Environmental Affairs Division, now in the Ministry of Planning. He had been involved in the climate change discussion for several years before I joined. And when I was first coming into it, it was Kishan who I had to lean on heavily to explain the dynamic, what was going on. Foreign Affairs had not really had a very hands-on role before that. It was being led through the Environment Ministry, my ministry.
Excellent, excellent. So then you leave Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then what's the next thing?
Well, I was posted a year and a half after getting into the ministry. I was posted to the Trinidad and Tobago Permanent Mission to the United Nations in New York.
Wow.
Um, yes, so that happened in 2010. And at the time, I was assigned to a number of different things because it's a small mission and a lot of work. So
Yeah.
you have to do a little bit of everything. So at the time, I was doing peace and security, which was a very high priority for Trinidad and Tobago, especially discussion on small arms and light weapons. But I also covered the Sustainable Development Desk, which included a bit of climate change, and eventually Eventually, I shifted over to focus completely on the Sustainable Development Desk. So that's when I would have been involved in, the third international conference for small island developing states. The fourth one is coming up next year, and would have been involved in the process to develop the Sustainable Development Goals and the post 2030 agenda and all of that work. But I was also still somehow involved in climate, which is effectively two jobs, but it was one job. So I was still heavily involved in climate. I got kind of sort of roped in back into climate in a very big way as an AUSIS negotiator on legal issues. That was my first assignment in climate in 2011. That was a real baptism by fire. And after that, yeah, I've constantly held roles where I negotiate on behalf of AUSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States. So I was doing the SDGs and the development of the SDGs in New York, and then at the same time, also doing the climate meetings that would have resulted in the Paris Agreement in 2015. So those two processes at the same time, which was quite an interesting experience. Thankfully, I was very young at the time, so I had energy.
But, speaking of very young at the time, you would have been, in many instances, the youngest person in the room negotiating.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
how was that for you? Did you feel respected? Did you feel like, you felt confident to hold your own? Tell me a little bit about that.
I used to have to remind myself every day that for the purpose of international law and international relations and treaties, that, all states are equal. Yes, that was the reminder that I had to give myself, that we are all sovereign and equal, regardless of who is sitting in the seat, regardless of how small the country is, regardless of, how influential one might consider the country to be. It, I would say, was consistently an exercise of having to prove myself. It was consistently an exercise of being underestimated.
Yeah.
But it's being, I have found that being underestimated is not a bad thing. It is not a bad thing in and of itself, because then you have the element of surprise in your favor, and you can choose your moment. You can choose your moment. And I did do a lot of that.
Right?
Um,
Because they don't know. I might be young, I might be from a small island state, but I've been a part of many of these negotiations. I am well read, and, yeah, I love that.
yeah,
Choose your moment.
yeah, yeah. Choose your moment. I did a lot of that coming up.
It's sort of that saying, walk quietly but with a big stick.
I suppose. Yeah, no, it really was. I mean, the kinds of high stakes discussions I was thrown into. So, for example, in 2011, yes, in 2011, when we agreed as the international community to work on um, an agreement which would eventually become the Paris Agreement, and to complete it by 2015. In 2012, we had to decide on who was going to preside over these discussions.
Yeah.
And the Ministry of Environment at the time put Kishan forward to preside over the discussions. I recall he had the support of everyone. He's well known in the process, well
Well
respected.
liked. Yeah.
He had chaired a number of different processes before. And then India also decided they wanted to preside over those proceedings because they had a very special interest in making sure that the Paris Agreement would not, in its operation and its design, undermine their national priorities. And so we entered into a negotiation for 2 weeks to decide on India versus Trinidad and Tobago.
Wow.
And
Wow.
as the representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who was at the meeting, it meant that it fell on my shoulders to deal with those negotiations. It was a very difficult time because we
Wow.
do not vote in the UNFCCC. Voting is very anathema. So it means that in situations like this, consultations have to resolve the impasse. And I remember the consultations were presided by the Minister of the Environment from South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant woman, Ambassador De Seco, the ambassador from South Africa, Ambassador De Seco. Brilliant, brilliant lady. Not the most patient. Um, yeah, it was quite grueling. It was quite grueling. I mean, I was told on more than one occasion, Trinidad and Tobago is a small country, you should step back.
Ah, of
Um,
course, yes. The typical, well, this doesn't mean as much to you.
you should step back.
Yeah.
Um, we had to rally support from CARICOM, from AOSIS, from within the group of Latin American Caribbean states, as in we had the support of Brazil.
Mm,
And this isn't a discussion, this is India.
yeah.
So it was an interesting time. In the end, I think there was a very, very, very satisfactory agreement reached, um, where before going into the discussion, everybody was of the view that there would be one presiding officer for the entirety of the negotiation process, the 3 or so years.
Mm-hmm.
We came out of it agreeing that there would be six.
Okay.
Yes. So in instances like this in a UN context, what we do is
Yeah.
we add so that everybody can get something.
Right.
So we ended up with starting off, I think it was India and Norway as co-chairs, and then moving on to Trinidad and Tobago and the European Union.
Oh,
And
wow.
in the agreement that we reached, Trinidad and Tobago was the co-chair for the longest period of time.
Very
So
nice.
in Norway would have co-chaired for I think 6 months, Trinidad and Tobago and the European Union for a year and a half. And then I think for the last stretch, it would have been the United States and Egypt. So
Nice.
yeah, yeah, it was a very interesting time. But yeah, I was very young, and um, having to deal with a very, very high stakes issue at the time. So it was one of those critical learning moments.
Yeah. What did you rely on within yourself? Like what got you through it?
A real belief in multilateralism, I have to say. Um, I know that sounds idealistic, but I am a bit of an idealist. Um, a real rock solid belief in multilateralism and in the multilateral system where countries are sovereign and equal.
Mm,
Um, Otherwise, I would have been intimidated
of course. Of course.
immediately, right?
Yeah.
And so a belief in the fact that even though I represented a very small country,
Yeah.
even though I myself was not the most senior person, having to do those negotiations, that we had every right to be there. We
Yeah.
had every right to put forward our candidates. We had every right to see the process through till the end. And we were prepared to vote. We were
Yeah.
prepared to vote and lose, but India was not prepared to vote and lose. So,
Ah,
so then it had to be resolved.
yeah. And that's so interesting. And I think it's such a great sort of parallel for women and the world of work, right? That understanding that we're all equal and we have a right to be here and and believing in that we have a right to leadership, we have a right to fulfill our potential. And that there is so much that we are often intimidated out of that
Mhm.
we ought not, that we need to just be willing to see the process through.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was really a test of will. It was a test of will, but I think in the end we got the best agreement.
Fantastic, fantastic. So then after that, what happens?
So I stayed with the ministry and with the mission until 2016.
Hmm.
Um, at which point I decided to leave to pursue a master's degree, a dual master's degree. Actually, the week before I was told that I was being posted to New York, I had just submitted an application to do a master's program.
Mm,
And I remember, I don't know if I was speaking to the PS or the minister because I needed permission in order to send in the application. And they were like, "Are you sure this is what you want to do? Because I'm not sure this is what you will end up doing." And I said, "No, no, no, this is what I want to do. I really think I want to do this master's and then I'll come back afterwards." And then I got posted to New York and I nearly didn't go because I
Yeah.
was like, well, this really wasn't in my plan. But in the end, I did end up going. But pursuing the master's it had been a dream deferred.
Mm.
So by 2016, having done the SCGs and many other processes, having done the negotiations leading up to the Paris Agreement, and spent my fair share of time in the UN New York grinding machine, um, I decided that it was time to pick up that dream deferred, and without knowing anything, without knowing how I was going to pay for it, without knowing anything at all, um, I applied for a dual degree program because the program captured my imagination. So
What
the
was this program?
dual degree program, with 1 year at Sciences Po in Paris.
Mm.
So the Paris School of International Affairs, and 1 year at Georgetown in the Georgetown, Washington, D.C., in their LLM program. And so by 2016, I was kind of having a crisis trying to figure out, well, are you a lawyer or are you a diplomat? Can you be both? What is both? What are you doing? Like, where do you go from here? So I thought, okay, I'll do this master's program that allows me to study across both disciplines. And I'd always wanted to live in Paris anyway, so I was like, why not? So without knowing anything, I applied. Um, I got in, and I was like, okay, how do we do?
Oh no.
How do we do this? What do we do now? And my parents were in Germany at the time. They were living there, and I remember saying to them, well, interestingly, for Sciences Po, they calculated student fees based on your parents' tax residence.
Wow.
So I had to submit my parents' tax forms, and based on their tax residence and their tax bracket, I was able to go to school there practically for free.
Oh, fantastic. So what are your parents doing? Why were they in Germany?
So my stepdad is German. My
Mm,
stepdad is German. So yeah, my mom, they had been living there at the time. They're not there anymore. They've now retired in Tobago.
okay.
Um, but yeah, my stepdad is a photographer, cameraman,
Oh, nice.
and yes, and they were living in Germany at the time. And and my mom, it didn't work. So it became a easy solution for me. Well, I'll just submit their tax forms and
Yeah,
go to school for free. I
fabulous.
think I paid €5 to go to do that program.
Money
Yeah.
well spent. Well spent.
Well,
And what about
well,
the Georgetown component? That couldn't have been
that
cheap.
one, no, that was crazy. That was good. The American system works. So
Yeah.
I was able to get a loan for that one. Um, my parents gave me a loan actually for that one. So yeah, it was a miracle even for me even to be accepted and then to figure it out. I had to jump through so many hoops. I had to call in so many favors. I had to call a friend in the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs to help me get an appointment to get the visa in order to get there on time.
Wow.
Like everything known to man in terms of everything that had to line up really had to line up very precisely to get me there, and somehow magically it did.
And that's how
It
you
did.
knew. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. That's why I knew. I was like, well, this is what I was supposed to be doing. So yeah, I did that for 2 years. I also got a job at the same time because I was like, how am I going to support myself? Um, but luckily for me, almost before as soon as I found out that I'd gotten accepted, I also got a job at the same time. With the
Nice.
company that I'm still with now, Climate Analytics.
Excellent.
Um, so yeah, and they were like, yeah, you can study and work with us. That's fine, no problem. And I was like, okay, great.
Excellent. Excellent. So, and you are the new director of the Caribbean. So tell us about what you're doing now.
Yeah, so now I'm again a bit off on a new adventure. Um, So in the time since I did my master's, and I've been working with climate analytics, as well as also doing consultancy with other entities, organizations in the same type of field, but all really focus on the international process.
Mhm.
Um, but remember, I told you when I started the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, my focus was regional. I was
Yeah.
into CARICOM, I was into how is CSME functioning, what about the regional integration, the vision of federation, all of these things.
Yes.
And so that is still a seed in my mind, never goes away. And I had always wanted to do implementation work,
Hmm.
work on the ground that aligns with what's happening globally, picks up a bit on what's happening globally, but also is able to contribute. So kind of creating that two-way street.
Yeah.
So that was my vision for Climate Analytics Caribbean. So yeah, in 2021, when I got the go ahead to let's see, and I went full steam ahead, full
Nice.
steam ahead. I have a small team now. They're amazing. The team continues to grow. The portfolio of work is really, really exciting stuff for me. It's things that think I feel as though I've been so lucky. Things that literally I imagined, things that lived in my imagination, I'm actually able to do, to conceptualize it in a project form, to find somebody who is willing to support it, and then to actually be able to implement it. Yeah, nothing is, for me, career-wise, I don't know that I've done anything as yet that delivers the kind of payoff that my work in the region does for me personally, to be able to see a problem, design a solution, get support, and then do it is just amazing. So that is the work that I'm doing now, in addition to still working internationally as well. But yeah.
And so what do you attribute that good luck to? Because I tell my chief of staff at the accelerator all the time. She's like, "Oh, I'm just lucky." And I was like, somehow hardworking people are always very, very lucky. So what do you attribute your good luck to?
Um, I mean, for me, it's the same. It goes back to me joining the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2009 and what was going on then. And I think it's really just a question of circumstance meeting preparedness. Um, so the circumstance in this instance is that we are, just getting into the flow of the implementation of the Paris Agreement,
Mhm.
just beginning to understand how important it is that even as we cross the final T's and dot the final I's on the design of the sort of international monitoring mechanism through the agreement. It's so important to make sure that the enable environments are being created at the local, national, regional levels in order to ensure that implementation actually happens.
Yeah.
Um, and because I have been a part of the architecture of the agreement, I have a very good understanding of what it takes in order to be able to implement it and what it will take. So that's the preparedness element. I am able to see and dream and design things that really fit in very well with the international operating context. Um, so it's preparedness that meets circumstance. I don't know. Yeah, I think that's how my luck works if I have luck. I hope it holds, but yeah.
And what's the best advice you've ever gotten? Best career advice
Best career advice
or
I
best
have.
advice in general?
Hmm. This is a hard one. I have a terrible memory, but I will say, in 20, might have been 2012, I I was ready to quit my job. I was ready to pack it up. Um, something had happened in the course of a meeting that had left me so devastated and disappointed that I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm leaving.
Oh,
And a senior diplomat in the ministry spoke to me afterwards. I explained to him what happened. I said, I can't do this anymore. How do you do this? How have you done this for so long? And he said, what did he say? He told me that people will disappoint you.
Mm.
People will disappoint you, but that does not mean that you abandon the things that are important to you.
Oh, wow.
So, and I really I took it to heart in the sense that, okay, I feel very disappointed in this moment, but I still believe in this mission and I
Yeah.
believe in this project and I understand my role in it and I know I still have something to contribute. So in spite of the disappointment, I could find a way to go on.
Mm.
And yeah, it was great advice at the time.
That's excellent advice, I think, and certainly, and look at your career. I mean, absolutely incredible. And what's the advice that you give to young women or other diverse candidates who are pursuing their careers? What's the advice that you give?
Mm, believe in yourself.
Excellent.
It is the only way. I
Excellent.
mean, it sounds very cliche, but it's about believing that you have something to contribute and believing that your ideas are valid and they are worthwhile and they're just as good as anybody else's. Um, yeah, it's something that I have had to always come back to constantly,
Mm.
um, constantly, because it really is necessary. Otherwise we tend to think we don't even put ourselves forward because
Yeah,
we don't even give ourselves a chance to compete in the race. We pull out
yeah.
before the race even begins. So believe in yourself. The idea is valid, the dream is valid, the contribution is important, and it will make a difference.
Oh, what a beautiful note for us to end on. And if you heard that message was for you.
Yes,
It,
indeed.
yeah. Thank you so much, Rueanna. I loved having this conversation with you. I always enjoy and the fleeting chances that I get to see you crossing the globe from any other places. We almost never see each other in Trinidad. But
Yes.
it's so lovely to have had this chat with you. And I loved, just how resilient you've been and being willing to take chances, believing in yourself, trying to figure things out, being willing to make mistakes, being thrust into things and finding it exciting versus being daunting. I absolutely loved the advice about people will disappoint you, but that does not mean that the work that you're doing doesn't matter, and don't throw out everything out of one disappointment. I think all really, really great nuggets for us to hold close as we continue trying to present the best that we have to offer. I think my favorite part was you being in that negotiation and believing in multilateralism and believing that we are all sovereign nations and we are all equal, and so I don't have to be intimidated because we're a small country. We don't just have to back down. I loved it all because that's something that it's easy for someone to attempt to intimidate us and to make us believe we're not enough.
Yes,
Believe in
exactly.
yourself. You are enough and you have a right to be in whatever room you find yourself in. So if you haven't already, please subscribe and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rueanna.
Thank you so much, Racquel. This was so lovely. All the best. And hopefully I'll see you soon.
Yes, for sure. Bye.